Hey, in this video, I'm going to try and answer the question, is the Nikon Z6, this is the Nikon Z6 original, is this good for bird photography? So the Nikon Z6 is one of Nikon's first mirrorless cameras for the Z-mount system. Now, since the Nikon Z6 was released a long time ago, there have been some cameras that have been released by Nikon that are much better for bird photography, like the Nikon Z9 and the Z8 and even the Z6 III. And those have much better autofocus. Nevertheless, this camera, the Nikon Z6, is fairly cheap right now. So if you're wondering whether this camera is good for bird photography, I'm going to try and answer that question for you today. So the first thing I'd like to say about the Nikon Z6 is that I've taken a lot of pictures I really liked with the Nikon Z6. I'm going to show some of these on the screen. And I would say that for many kinds of photography, the Z6 is more than sufficient. And this category is mainly things like still birds, so birds that aren't flying, birds that aren't doing too many complex maneuvers. The autofocus system of the Nikon Z6 really isn't that bad. It's very accurate, in fact, more accurate than my Nikon D500 camera. And so for certain situations, it does really well. And there's another thing that I like about the Nikon Z6 over my older Nikon D500 DSLR is that it has this screen which comes out, which is really good for low shots. There are actually some really nice low shots that I've gotten with this camera that I couldn't have gotten with my D500 because the D500 just doesn't have the autofocus capability with the live view rear screen, whereas the Nikon Z6 does have that capability. So that's another cool thing about it. But what is not so good about the autofocus system of the Nikon Z6? Well, I would say it's not very capable for fast action like flying birds or when animals are moving in a complex way. It doesn't acquire focus very fast either. So even when the animal is still and you're kind of in a dark area like a forest, I mean, I've brought the Nikon Z6 into a forest, and when the ISO gets very high and there's not much light, I think that the autofocus system doesn't really grab onto something. And that's comparing it to my Nikon D500, where if I'm even in a dark area, as long as I pre-focus a little bit, the Nikon D500 really just grabs into my subject. So I really like that of the Nikon D500, and the Z6 does not do that very quickly. So the autofocus system of the Z6 is good, it's accurate, but it's really not that fast to acquire, and it's not that fast to rack focus either. So when you're in a situation where an animal is moving very quickly and you need to acquire focus very quickly, it's not that good. That doesn't mean you can't get good action shots with the Z6. Let's say you have like a duck floating in the water and it's moving a little bit and you can acquire focus. It does track pretty well and you can use it in situations like that. So it's not useless and it can be used in some action scenarios, but if you're going to be regularly taking action shots like birds in flight or birds rapidly moving from branch to branch in darker areas, or maybe it's like another kind of animal, then you might have a little bit of trouble acquiring focus and keeping focus in difficult situations. The Z6 also doesn't have subject recognition modes like on the later Nikon cameras, like on the Z8 or the Z9. Those have like bird recognition modes, whereas the Z6 does not have those modes. And so you're going to have to use the basic focusing modes that are provided on the Z6 to recognize those subjects. So that's the main deficiency there. So I think if you want to get into bird photography, you can certainly take lots of cool pictures of birds with the Z6. But you're not going to be easily capturing birds in difficult situations or animals in difficult situations if they're moving quickly, or if you only have a split second to get the shot and then the animal disappears, you're going to miss out on some of those shots. So that's kind of my overall feeling of this camera. It's really not a bad camera. It can definitely get you some great shots, and I've taken quite a few photos I like with this camera, but it's not good for action. It's mainly good for slower types of wildlife photography. And that's a valid branch of wildlife photography too. If you want to take more environmental shots of birds, then the Nikon Z6 is a good option for that. But I think if you're going to go for the action style of photography, like birds in flight, then the Nikon Z8 or the Nikon Z9 or even the later version, the Nikon Z6 III, are going to be better choices for that kind of photography. One last thing I want to mention is that if you're into video, the Z6 could be a really good choice for that, because if you're taking videos of birds or other animals, you won't need to rely on autofocus as much. You're looking more for behavioral interactions of birds. And so in those cases, as long as you're not going to take a video of flying birds, the Z6 can be a good option for video because the video quality on it is very high. It's got 4K 30 and it has 1080p 120. So you have a lot of video flexibility with the Z6 in taking video. Conclusion. So should you get the Nikon Z6 for bird photography? Well, I think it's an interesting choice, and it could be a nice camera to get if you're just starting out and you want to wait until you're interested in the subject to get a better camera. But if you already know you really like bird photography, then I think it can't really be a main camera for bird photography. I think the other later generation Nikons are a much better choice for that, or even if you don't mind getting a DSLR, the Nikon D500 or the D850 would also be better choices than the Nikon Z6. But if you just want a backup camera in the Z system for bird photography, it might not be a bad choice if you only go after still subject or slower styles of bird photography. So thanks for watching this video. I hope that answered the question, is the Nikon Z6 good for bird photography? And I'll see you again in the next video.